It was a rainy midnight in Manhattan. A tired black father walked into a luxury hotel carrying his sleeping little girl on one shoulder and a bouquet of dying white lilies in his hand. His coat was old, his boots were muddy, and everyone behind the marble front desk looked at him like he didn't belong. He only asked for one room for the night, but the receptionist smiled coldly and told him the hotel was fully booked. Moments later, she handed the penthouse key to a wealthy couple in designer clothes. His daughter looked up at him and whispered, "Daddy, did we do something wrong?" The man said nothing. He only turned toward a portrait hanging above the fireplace. And what no one in that lobby knew was that the woman in that portrait was his dead wife. And this hotel was about to learn who he really was. Rain drifted over Manhattan in silver sheets, soft enough to look beautiful from a distance, and cold enough to cut through wool the moment you stepped into it. Midnight traffic crawled along Lexington Avenue beneath a blur of neon reflections and red brake lights. Somewhere down the block, a saxophone player stood beneath the awning of a closed cigar shop, drawing low, mournful notes into the wet December air, while people hurried past without looking at him. At the corner of 54th Street, the Monarch Crescent Hotel rose into the night like something carved out of gold and glass. Light spilled from its towering windows onto the rain-dark sidewalk where black SUVs idled beneath the canopy, and valets in tailored coats moved briskly between luggage carts and revolving doors. A yellow cab eased to the curb. For a moment, no one got out. Then the rear door opened slowly, and a tall black man stepped into the rain with a sleeping child in his arms. His name was Elijah Brooks. Water rolled from the shoulders of his charcoal coat, old enough at the seams to have lost its shape years ago. Mud clung to the edges of his boots. One hand supported the little girl resting against his chest, while the other held a bouquet of white lilies wrapped in damp brown paper. The flowers had begun to wilt around the edges, their petals curling inward from the cold. Tucked beneath the ribbon was a small handwritten card, "Still missing you. Every single day." Elijah looked up once at the hotel, not with awe, not with hesitation, with something quieter than either. The cab driver popped the trunk. Elijah reached in and pulled out a worn canvas backpack with a broken zipper before thanking the driver in a tired voice. The man nodded politely, though his eyes lingered a little too long on Elijah's clothes before the taxi disappeared back into traffic. The little girl stirred against his chest. "Daddy," she murmured sleepily. "I got you," Elijah whispered. Ava Brooks was 7 years old, and impossibly small beneath the oversized knit hat pulled low over her curls. One of her tiny hands clutched the collar of her father's coat, while the other wrapped around a stuffed rabbit whose fur had thinned from years of being loved too hard. A thin silver bracelet rested around her wrist. Engraved into the metal, in delicate cursive letters, was one name: Naomi. Elijah adjusted her gently higher against his shoulder and stepped beneath the hotel canopy. The doorman moved automatically toward the entrance, then slowed almost imperceptibly when he saw Elijah up close. His smile remained professional, but something cautious flickered behind it. Elijah noticed. Men like him always noticed. Still, the doorman opened the door. "Good evening, sir." "Evening." Warmth wrapped around Elijah the second he entered the lobby. Not ordinary warmth, expensive warmth. The kind designed by architects and interior designers who understood how wealth was supposed to feel before a single word was spoken. The lobby of the Monarch Crescent glowed beneath enormous crystal chandeliers that scattered fractured gold across polished marble floors. Jazz drifted softly from hidden speakers overhead. Near the fireplace, a pianist in a black tuxedo played something slow and melancholy, while guests in tailored coats sipped cocktails beneath walls lined with dark walnut and brass. Ava lifted her head slightly at the sound of the piano. Her sleepy eyes widened. Whoa! Elijah felt her small fingers tighten against him. The place was beautiful, painfully beautiful, and for one brief second, standing there beneath the chandeliers with rainwater still sliding from his coat, Elijah almost forgot why he had come. Then his eyes drifted upward. Above the marble fireplace hung a portrait nearly 6 feet tall. A black woman stood, captured in black and white. Her face turned slightly away from the camera as laughter lit her features with impossible warmth. Wind lifted loose strands of hair across her cheek. Her eyes held the kind of joy that reached people even through silence. Naomi Brooks. Elijah stopped breathing for half a heartbeat. The lilies trembled faintly in his hand. 3 years, and seeing her face still felt like stepping onto broken glass barefoot. Ava followed his gaze toward the portrait. Even through exhaustion, recognition softened her expression immediately. "That's Mommy," she whispered. Elijah nodded once. The piano continued somewhere far away. A couple laughed near the elevators. Glasses clinked softly behind the lobby bar. Life moved forward with unbearable ease. While Elijah stood, staring at the woman, the world had continued without. He remembered the last time Naomi had stood in this lobby alive, barefoot after midnight because her heels were killing her feet, holding 2 cups of terrible vending machine coffee while construction crews finished the East Wing renovation upstairs. She had laughed at him for obsessing over marble samples while she worried about things he had once considered small. How people feel when they walk through those doors matters more than how the floors look, she had told him. At the time, Elijah had kissed her forehead and said she was being dramatic. Now, he would have traded every building he owned to hear her say it again. "Daddy?" Ava's voice pulled him back. She looked around the lobby carefully, taking in the chandeliers, the grand staircase, the women in evening gowns descending from the mezzanine level. "Why does this place look like a castle?" Elijah smiled faintly. "Because people pay a lot of money for it too." Ava leaned closer against him. "Are we staying here tonight?" For a second, Elijah didn't answer. His eyes lingered on Naomi's portrait one final moment before he turned away. "Maybe," he said quietly. He crossed the marble floor toward the reception desk. Behind it stood a woman in her late 20s with perfectly styled blonde hair swept into a low knot. Her posture was immaculate, practiced down to the angle of her shoulders. A silver name tag rested against her navy blazer. Claire Whitmore. She was typing something into her computer when Elijah approached, but the moment she looked up, something subtle changed in her expression. Not hostility, assessment. Her eyes moved quickly over the worn coat, the rain-soaked boots, the backpack, the sleeping child, the wilted flowers. The smile she gave him arrived a fraction too late. "Good evening," she said. "Welcome to the Monarch Crescent." Elijah shifted Ava carefully in his arms. "Evening. I'd like a room for the night. Just one room." Claire's fingers paused over the keyboard. She gave another quick glance toward his clothes before typing. Or pretending to type. "I'm very sorry, sir," she said, after barely 3 seconds. "We're fully booked tonight." Elijah studied her face quietly. He had spent 30 years building businesses. He knew the difference between inconvenience and dismissal. One came with apology, the other came rehearsed. Still, his voice remained calm. "Nothing at all?" "I'm afraid not." Ava buried her face against his shoulder again, half asleep. Elijah nodded slowly. I understand. And he truly might have left then. If the revolving door had not spun open again at that exact moment. A burst of cold air swept into the lobby as a wealthy couple entered laughing beneath a massive black umbrella. The man wore a camel overcoat over a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's rent. The woman beside him glittered with diamonds at her ears and throat. Claire's entire demeanor transformed instantly. Her smile widened with genuine warmth. Mr. and Mrs. Langford, she said brightly, welcome back. Your penthouse suite is ready. We've already sent up the Bordeaux you requested. The couple smiled without even looking at Elijah, standing 3 feet away. A gold room key changed hands. The elevator doors opened moments later, and just like that, they were gone. Silence settled between Elijah and Claire. Not awkward silence, the dangerous kind. Claire realized her mistake almost immediately. A flicker of color rose beneath her makeup before professionalism snapped back into place. Elijah spoke softly. I thought you said you were fully booked. Claire straightened slightly. They had a standing reservation, sir. I see. His tone remained polite, almost gentle. That somehow made it worse. Ava lifted her head sleepily again and looked between them. Then, in a small, uncertain voice that barely carried above the piano music, she asked, Daddy, did we do something wrong? The question hung there, simple, honest, sharp enough to cut through marble. Something shifted in Claire's face for the briefest instant, but it disappeared just as quickly behind trained professionalism. Elijah looked down at his daughter. He brushed damp curls gently away from her forehead and kissed the top of her head before answering. No, baby, he said quietly, not a thing. But when he lifted his eyes again toward the portrait above the fireplace, something deep behind them had changed. The warmth in the lobby no longer felt warm. It felt heavy, and somewhere near the elevators, unnoticed by almost everyone in the room, an older black security guard standing beneath a walnut column had gone completely still the moment Elijah walked through the doors. His name was Marcus Reed, and the second he recognized the man holding the lilies, the blood drained slowly from his face. Marcus Reed had spent 22 years standing watch inside the Monarch Crescent, long enough to recognize the sound of expensive shoes before they crossed the marble, long enough to tell which guests tipped generously and which ones smiled only when people richer than them were watching, long enough to understand that luxury changed people, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once, and long enough to know exactly who Elijah Brooks was the second he stepped through those revolving doors carrying wilted lilies and a sleeping child. Marcus had almost moved immediately. Instinct had nearly pulled him across the lobby before common sense caught him by the throat, because Elijah had seen him too, only for a second, a brief glance across polished marble, and then the smallest shake of Elijah's head. Not now. Marcus obeyed, though every muscle in his body hated it. From beneath the walnut column near the elevators, he watched Claire Whitmore straighten papers that did not need straightening, while pretending the silence between her and Elijah was under control. He watched Ava press her cheek against her father's shoulder again, small enough that one arm could still carry her entire world. He watched guests nearby begin to notice that something uncomfortable was unfolding. The thing about expensive hotels was that people claimed to hate scenes while secretly leaning toward them the moment they appeared. Near the bar, a man lowered his whiskey halfway to his mouth. A woman in an emerald gown glanced over the rim of her champagne glass. Somewhere behind the concierge desk, Two bellhops slowed their conversation without fully stopping it. Claire folded her hands together. "If you'd like," she said carefully. "There's a Holiday Inn about 8 blocks downtown. They usually have late availability." Elijah looked at her for a long moment. Not angry, not embarrassed, just tired. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the city. Water streaked down the towering windows overlooking Lexington Avenue, blurring the lights beyond into gold and white smears. "I'm sure there is," Elijah said softly. Claire nodded quickly, relieved by his calmness. "I can call them for you." Before Elijah could answer, another voice entered the conversation. "What seems to be the issue here?" The man approaching from the far side of the lobby moved with brisk authority, his polished shoes clicking sharply against marble. Mid-40s, lean build, silver tie perfectly centered beneath an expensive charcoal suit. His dark hair was combed with mathematical precision, not a strand out of place. Daniel Mercer, night manager. Claire's shoulders relaxed almost immediately when she saw him. "Mr. Mercer," she said, lowering her voice slightly, "this gentleman is upset because we don't have any rooms available." Daniel barely looked at Elijah at first. His attention went automatically to the backpack, the wet coat, the child, the flowers. A rapid professional scan honed by years in luxury hospitality, assessment, before empathy. Then his eyes flicked briefly toward nearby guests who had begun paying attention. That changed everything. Daniel offered Elijah a thin, controlled smile. "Good evening, sir. I'm Daniel Mercer, the night manager. I understand there's been some confusion." "No confusion," Elijah replied. "I asked for a room. And unfortunately, we're at capacity tonight." Elijah nodded once, toward the elevators, where the Langfords had disappeared less than 2 minutes earlier. "You didn't seem full a moment ago." Claire shifted uncomfortably behind the desk. Daniel's expression hardened, almost invisibly. "Those guests booked months in advance. Then maybe there's a cancellation list. I'm afraid our accommodations are reserved for confirmed guests." The wording landed carefully. Reserved for confirmed guests. Not reserved for people like you, but close enough that everyone heard it anyway. Ava lifted her head again. Her sleepy eyes moved between the adults, confusion slowly replacing exhaustion. Elijah adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. "You hear that rain, baby?" he murmured gently. She nodded. "That storm's working harder than all of us tonight." A tiny smile touched her lips before fading again. Daniel watched the interaction with increasing impatience. He had seen situations like this before. Not identical, but similar enough. Manhattan drew people desperate to brush against wealth, to stand inside places they could never afford, to pretend for a few minutes they belonged there. And truthfully, Daniel hated what that reality had turned him into. There had been a time, years ago, when he might have approached this differently, before luxury hospitality, before investors, before endless meetings about brand perception, before learning that one viral incident could cost a property millions. Now, all he saw were risks, and Elijah Brooks, standing in a rain-soaked coat with a sleeping child in his arms while half the lobby quietly stared, looked dangerously close to one. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. "Sir, I need to ask you not to linger in the lobby if you're not a registered guest." There it was, not rude enough to report, just cruel enough to feel. Something flickered across Elijah's face then. Small, brief, gone almost instantly. Not humiliation, recognition, as though he had heard those words before somewhere far away in another lifetime. Behind the concierge station, A young valet muttered quietly under his breath. "This is messed up." Another employee elbowed him immediately to shut him up. Claire kept her eyes locked on the computer screen, even though she wasn't typing anything anymore. Daniel noticed the attention growing around them and decided to end the situation quickly. "If transportation is an issue," he said, "we can arrange a cab to a more appropriate hotel." A woman near the fireplace looked down awkwardly into her drink. Even some of the guests were beginning to feel the ugliness settling into the room now. Elijah glanced slowly around the lobby, at the chandeliers, at the marble, at the guests pretending not to stare, at the portrait of Naomi above the fireplace, then back to Daniel. "More appropriate," Elijah repeated quietly. Daniel immediately realized how that sounded. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" The question came softly. That was the problem with men like Elijah. Daniel knew the type immediately. Calm men. Men who never raised their voices because they didn't need to. Men who forced everyone else to hear the weight of their own words. Daniel straightened his jacket. "Sir, the Monarch Crescent maintains a certain atmosphere for its guests. And my daughter threatens that atmosphere?" Ava looked up at her father when she heard the word daughter. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. "No one said that. You didn't have to." The pianist in the corner stopped playing. Not intentionally. His hands simply slowed on the keys before drifting into silence altogether. Somewhere near the elevators, a phone camera appeared discreetly above someone's purse. Marcus saw it happen and felt dread settle heavily into his stomach. Not because Elijah would be exposed, because everyone else would. Claire suddenly spoke up, too quickly. "Sir, nobody's judging you." The moment the words left her mouth, she seemed to regret them. Elijah looked at her with quiet disbelief. For the first time all evening, a faint edge entered his voice. "Miss, people start judging each other before they even finish saying hello." Claire's cheeks flushed. Daniel stepped forward slightly, reclaiming control of the interaction. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one final time to either book elsewhere or leave the lobby." Ava's small fingers tightened around Elijah's coat. "Daddy," her voice trembled this time. Elijah looked down immediately. The hardness vanished from his face. The second his eyes found her. "It's all right." "No, it's not," she whispered. The words were tiny, but in the stillness of that marble lobby, they seemed to echo anyway. Ava turned, carefully, in her father's arms, until she could see Daniel and Claire clearly. Children had a way of staring directly at people when adults no longer could. "If my daddy looks poor," she asked softly, "does that make him bad?" No one answered. Not Daniel, not Claire, not the guests pretending not to listen. The silence that followed was far worse than if someone had spoken. Claire's composure cracked first, barely. Her eyes darted away toward the computer monitor again, but not before guilt flashed visibly across her face. Daniel felt something unpleasant in his chest, because the truth was, he knew exactly how this looked. And worse than that, part of him knew the little girl was right. But years inside buildings like this had taught him something dangerous. Making exceptions based on emotion, the machine stopped functioning. Luxury depended on illusion, on exclusivity, on carefully controlled comfort. That was what investors paid for. That was what guests expected. And Daniel Mercer had spent 12 years sacrificing pieces of himself to protect it. Near the far hallway leading toward administration offices, another woman had appeared unnoticed during the confrontation. Sarah Collins, early 50s, sharp eyes, warm face, one of the few remaining employees who had worked at the Monarch Crescent since its opening years. She had trained under Naomi Brooks herself. And the second Sarah saw Elijah standing there with lilies in his hand, ice spread through her veins. "Oh my God," she whispered. She moved quickly toward Daniel, stopping just beside him before lowering her voice. "Daniel," he didn't look at her. "What? You need to stop this, right now." "I'm handling it." "No," Sarah said quietly, her eyes fixed on Elijah. "You really aren't." Something in her tone finally made Daniel glance sideways. Sarah looked genuinely shaken. "What's that supposed to mean?" She hesitated, because suddenly she understood something terrible. Most of the newer staff had never actually met Elijah Brooks. After Naomi's death, he had vanished from public life almost entirely. No interviews, no board meetings, no charity galas. 5 years ago, his face had been everywhere in business magazines. Now, half the company wouldn't recognize him walking past them on the street. Daniel frowned. "Sarah?" She leaned closer. "You don't know who that man is." And for the first time all evening, uncertainty entered Daniel Mercer's eyes. Daniel Mercer stared at Sarah Collins for a long second, searching her face for some sign that this was a misunderstanding, some indication that exhaustion or panic had made her overreact. Instead, all he found was fear, real fear. Not the nervousness of an employee worried about conflict in the lobby, not embarrassment over guests filming a confrontation. Something deeper. Sarah rarely looked afraid of anything. "What are you talking about?" Daniel asked quietly. Sarah glanced toward Elijah again. Her throat moved once before she answered. "I'm talking about the fact that if you don't slow down and think very carefully about what happens next, this hotel is about to become the kind of story people remember for all the wrong reasons." Daniel's jaw tightened. Around them, the atmosphere in the lobby had changed shape entirely. The earlier discomfort had hardened into a tension now. Conversations had died off. Guests who should have been heading toward elevators or finishing drinks near the lounge had remained exactly where they were, drawn toward the tension gathering around the front desk like people standing too close to a cliff edge. A young woman seated beside the fireplace pretended to scroll through her phone, while her camera remained angled directly toward Elijah. Marcus noticed it too. His hand tightened around the radio clipped to his belt. He could stop this right now, he thought. One sentence. That was all it would take. But Elijah had asked him silently for patience, and Marcus understood why. Deep down, he understood it better than anyone in the room. Elijah wasn't testing policy. He was testing people. Daniel looked back toward Elijah and Ava. The child still rested against her father's chest, but sleep had fully left her eyes now. Fear lived there instead, small and trembling beneath confusion. One of her hands clutched the stuffed rabbit tighter, while the other twisted nervously in the fabric of Elijah's coat. And Elijah himself stood almost unnaturally still. No anger, no threats, no attempt to pull rank. That bothered Daniel more than shouting would have. Most humiliated men tried to reclaim power quickly. They raised their voices. They demanded respect. They threatened reviews, lawsuits, headlines. Elijah did none of those things. He simply stood there, allowing the room to reveal itself. Daniel felt irritation rise in his chest again. "Sir," he said carefully, "I understand emotions are running high, but this situation is becoming disruptive for our guests." Elijah's eyes moved slowly across the lobby. "Interesting word," he said. Daniel frowned slightly. "What is?" "Disruptive." The pianist near the fireplace had still not resumed playing. Rain whispered steadily against the windows overlooking Lexington Avenue. Somewhere outside, A siren wailed briefly before fading into the distance. Elijah shifted Ava gently higher in his arms before speaking again. My daughter and I walked in quietly. We asked for a room quietly. We accepted your answer quietly. His voice remained calm, almost conversational. But somehow, we became the disruption. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, because there was no clean response to that. Claire suddenly stepped in, eager to regain control of the situation before it slipped further. Sir, nobody is accusing you of anything, she said quickly. We're simply asking you to understand that this is a luxury property and what? Elijah asked softly. Claire stopped. A dangerous thing was happening now. Every unfinished sentence in the room had started speaking louder than the completed ones. Ava looked up at Claire again. Children noticed hesitation, instinctively. They sensed when adults were hiding behind words they didn't fully believe. Miss? Ava asked quietly. Claire looked down at her. Ava swallowed once, before speaking again. Would you have talked to us different if my daddy wore a suit? The question landed harder than the first one had, not because it was louder, because it was older somehow. Too old for a 7-year-old child to ask. Claire's face lost color. Across the lobby, one of the guests lowered his eyes into his drink. Another woman shifted uncomfortably beside her husband. Even the valet near the front entrance looked away toward the rain outside as though suddenly fascinated by traffic. Daniel felt the situation slipping out of his hands minute by minute. He made a decision. Enough. He turned slightly toward the security desk near the elevators. Tyler, Ben, 2 younger security guards straightened immediately and began walking toward the front desk. Neither looked particularly comfortable. Tyler, the taller of the two, glanced briefly toward Marcus as they passed him. Marcus said nothing. He simply stared ahead with the rigid stillness of a man holding himself together by force. The younger guards approached Elijah carefully, not aggressively, but visibly enough that the shift in atmosphere became immediate. Ava noticed them first. Her fingers tightened sharply around Elijah's coat. "Daddy, it's all right," Elijah murmured. But this time, even he sounded tired. Tyler cleared his throat awkwardly when they reached the desk. "Sir, management's asking us to escort you outside." The word escort hung in the air like something sour. Elijah looked at the young guard for a moment, then he nodded once. Not surrender, acknowledgement. He understood the position the kid had been placed in. "You seem like a decent man," Elijah said quietly. Tyler looked visibly uncomfortable. "Sir, I'm just doing my job." Elijah gave the faintest smile. That's usually where these stories begin. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose, already imagining how quickly this could still be contained if Elijah simply left now. No scene, no headlines, no social media clip stripped of context. Just another difficult interaction erased by tomorrow morning's checkouts. Then Ava spoke again. Not loudly, not dramatically, just honestly. "If my daddy looks poor," she whispered, her eyes moving slowly around the lobby, "does that make people scared of him?" The question broke something open in the room, not visibly, quietly, like ice beginning to crack beneath weight. Claire's eyes filled suddenly despite her attempts to remain composed. She looked away fast enough that only Sarah noticed. Daniel felt heat creeping into his collar, and Marcus Reed finally moved. Only one step, but it was enough. The old security guard walked slowly away from the walnut column for the first time since Elijah entered the hotel. His polished shoes crossed the marble with measured calm, while every younger employee instinctively straightened as he passed. Marcus carried respect inside the Monarch Crescent, the way some men carried rank in the military. He stopped beside Tyler and Ben. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "why don't you give this a minute?" Daniel turned sharply. "Marcus." Marcus looked at him directly. "With respect, sir," he said, "I think everybody in this room could use one." The challenge underneath the politeness was unmistakable. Daniel stared at him. "You're out of line." "No," Marcus replied quietly. "Line a while ago." Silence spread again, heavy now. Near the fireplace, the young woman filming lowered her phone slightly, no longer certain whether she was witnessing a scandal or something much worse. Sarah stepped forward at last. "Daniel," she said softly, "please." Something in her voice finally reached him. Not authority, not fear. Grief. Daniel looked around the lobby, at the staring guests, at Claire, barely holding herself together behind the desk, at the trembling child, at Elijah Brooks standing in soaked boots beneath crystal chandeliers with more dignity than anyone else in the building. And suddenly, Daniel became aware of something deeply unsettling. The man in front of him did not look defeated. He looked disappointed, as if this night had confirmed something he had desperately hoped was no longer true. Elijah lowered his eyes briefly toward Ava. Then, very gently, he kissed the top of her head. "Tonight," he said quietly, "you're learning something most adults spend their whole lives pretending not to see." Ava looked up at him. "What?" Elijah's gaze lifted slowly toward the portrait above the fireplace. "That some people see clothes before they see human beings." No one moved. No one spoke. And in the terrible stillness that followed, Daniel Mercer felt the first cold ripple of instinctive dread slide quietly down his spine, because somewhere deep inside himself, he was beginning to realize Sarah Collins might be right. For several long seconds, nobody in the lobby seemed willing to breathe too loudly. Rain continued slipping down the towering windows in silver trails. The chandeliers overhead glowed warmly against the dark marble and brass, but the warmth no longer reached anyone standing near the front desk. Even the air felt different now, tighter somehow, as though the building itself had become aware that something irreversible was unfolding beneath its ceiling. Daniel Mercer looked from Sarah Collins to Marcus Reed, and then back toward Elijah Brooks. "You're telling me," he said carefully, "that I'm supposed to know this man?" Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "Oh my God," she whispered. Claire's eyes moved uncertainly between them. "Sarah, who is he?" Sarah didn't answer immediately, because suddenly she understood exactly how impossible this looked. The Elijah Brooks the world remembered had once lived on magazine covers and business channels, tailored suits, charity galas, interviews beside Naomi, at hotel openings across Chicago, Atlanta, Los Angeles, but that Elijah had disappeared years ago. After Naomi died, he vanished from nearly everything public. No conferences, no Forbes interviews, no holiday campaigns. Rumors spread constantly through the company that he no longer even visited the properties he co-owned. Some employees believed he had retired. Others believed grief had broken him completely. The younger staff only knew the name, not the man. Marcus finally spoke, low, steady. "He's Elijah Brooks." The words landed quietly, but their effect moved through the lobby like a shockwave. Claire blinked once, then twice. Daniel's face emptied completely. "No," he said automatically. Marcus didn't look away from him. "Yes?" Tyler and Ben exchanged confused glances beside the desk. One of the bellhops near the entrance muttered, "Holy shit," beneath his breath, before immediately covering his mouth. Near the fireplace, the woman recording lowered her phone entirely now, her expression shifting from curiosity into disbelief. Daniel stared at Elijah again, really stared this time, and suddenly details he should have noticed earlier began rearranging themselves into something terrifyingly clear. The composure, the way Marcus had reacted, the way Sarah looked like she might faint, the portrait, the lilies. Daniel felt cold spread slowly through his chest. Elijah said nothing. He simply reached down carefully and set the wilted bouquet on the marble counter beside Claire's trembling hands. Then, with Ava still resting quietly against his shoulder, he turned away from the desk. The movement startled everyone. For a brief second, Daniel thought he was finally leaving. Instead, Elijah walked slowly across the lobby toward the enormous portrait hanging above the fireplace. Nobody stopped him. Nobody seemed capable of moving at all. His boots echoed softly against marble, while every eye in the room followed him. Ava lifted her head slightly again, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, even if she didn't fully understand it. When Elijah reached the fireplace, he stood silently beneath Naomi's portrait for a long moment. The entire lobby watched him look at her, not like a businessman admiring decor, like a man standing at a grave only he could see. Then very gently, Elijah reached up and lifted the portrait off the wall. Gasps broke softly across the room. Claire's hand flew to her mouth. "Sir," Daniel started instinctively. Elijah turned before he could finish, and for the first time all evening, there was something dangerous in his stillness. Not rage, pain, old pain, the kind that had survived long enough to become quiet. He carried the portrait carefully back toward the front desk, while the lobby parted around him without realizing it was doing so. Guests stepped aside automatically. The died entirely. Somewhere near the elevators, someone's champagne flute slipped from nervous fingers and shattered across marble with a bright, crystalline crack. Nobody looked toward the sound. Elijah stopped directly in front of Daniel Mercer, close enough now that Daniel could see exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, close enough to realize this man had probably not slept properly in years. Elijah tilted the portrait slightly. "Do you know who she is?" he asked softly. Daniel swallowed. "Yes," he managed. "That's Mrs. Naomi Brooks." Elijah nodded once. "My wife." The words seemed to pull the oxygen directly out of the room. Claire physically stepped backward from the desk. Tyler looked at Marcus in stunned disbelief. Ben muttered, "Jesus Christ," under his breath. Daniel's face had gone pale enough that the freckles beneath his skin became visible beneath the lobby lights. Elijah shifted Ava gently in one arm and reached into the inside pocket of his coat with the other. From a worn leather wallet, he removed an old photograph, softened at the edges from years of handling. He held it beside the portrait. A younger Naomi laughed into the camera, wearing jeans and a denim jacket, one arm wrapped around a much younger Elijah Brooks standing beside her beneath scaffolding and unfinished concrete beams. They were covered in dust. Naomi's hard hat sat crooked on her curls. Elijah looked at her the way certain men only ever look at one person in their entire lives. The same woman, the same smile, the same impossible warmth. Only now, she was alive. Daniel's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Elijah lowered the photograph slowly. 3 years ago tonight, he said quietly, my daughter and I buried her. Ava pressed her face into his shoulder again. The lobby remained completely silent. Not performatively silent, truly silent. Even the rain outside seemed farther away now. Elijah looked around the room slowly, at Claire, at Daniel, at the guests, at the employees frozen behind the desk, then finally at Sarah Collins. I came here tonight because every year on this date, Naomi and I used to walk this lobby together after midnight when the guests were asleep. His voice softened slightly. She liked seeing how people treated each other when nobody important was watching. Claire began crying soundlessly before she even realized she was crying. Daniel noticed none of it, because his entire world had narrowed to one horrifying realization. He had spent the last 20 minutes trying to remove the owner of the Monarch Crescent from his own hotel. And not just the owner, the man whose name sat on contracts, foundations, scholarships, employee relief funds, the man whose wife had built the culture the company still claimed to celebrate in every orientation video and annual report. Marcus stepped forward then, slowly, deliberately. The old security guard stopped beside Elijah, straightened his uniform jacket, and bowed his head with quiet dignity. "Welcome home, Mr. Brooks," he said softly. Emotion tightened his voice on the last word. Elijah looked at him finally, and for the first time all evening, warmth touched his face. "Good to see you, Marcus." Marcus nodded once, though his eyes had gone wet. "You too, sir." Daniel felt suddenly unsteady on his feet. "Mr. Brooks," he started quickly, "I sincerely apologize. I had no idea." "That's the problem," Elijah interrupted gently. Daniel stopped talking. Elijah's gaze held his. "You shouldn't have needed to know who I was." The sentence hit harder than shouting ever could have. Claire covered her mouth fully now as tears slipped through her fingers. Near the fireplace, the woman who had been recording lowered her phone completely at last, shame replacing fascination. And then, before anyone could speak again, a sharp voice echoed suddenly from the mezzanine staircase overhead. "What the hell is happening down there?" Heads turned instantly. A woman descended the staircase quickly in a fitted black coat over evening attire, her silver earrings catching the chandelier light with every step. Mid-50s, sharp posture, sharp eyes. The kind of woman whose authority entered a room before she finished crossing it. Evelyn Grant, Chief Executive Officer of Brooks Legacy Hotels. Someone must have called her upstairs the moment Marcus recognized Elijah. The second Evelyn saw him standing there beneath Naomi's portrait, all the color drained from her face. "Oh no," she whispered. Then she moved faster, past stunned guests, past Daniel, past the frozen reception desk, until she reached Elijah Brooks and stopped directly in front of him. For one suspended heartbeat, the entire lobby watched the CEO of a billion-dollar hospitality company lower her head in front of a man wearing muddy boots and carrying wilted lilies. "Mr. Brooks," Evelyn said quietly, her voice shaken in a way nobody there had likely ever heard before. "I am so deeply sorry." Nobody in the lobby seemed capable of looking anywhere except at Elijah Brooks. Not the guests, not the employees, not even Daniel Mercer, whose entire understanding of the last 20 minutes had collapsed so completely that he looked physically unable to process what was happening around him. Evelyn Grant straightened slowly after apologizing, though tension still held her shoulders rigid beneath her black coat. She glanced briefly toward Daniel, then Claire, then the younger security guards standing frozen beside the desk. The silence deepened. Elijah adjusted Ava carefully in his arms. The child had gone quiet again, exhausted by emotions too large for 7 years old to carry all at once. One tiny hand still clung to the stuffed rabbit, pressed between them, while the other rested against Elijah's chest, near the photograph tucked back inside his coat. For a moment, Elijah said nothing. He simply looked around the lobby. At the chandeliers, Naomi once chose herself after rejecting 12 others because they looked too cold. At the marble floors, she had insisted should never intimidate people. At the employees standing stiff with shame beneath the portrait of the woman who built the soul of the hotel they had forgotten how to protect. And somewhere underneath the exhaustion in Elijah's face, grief moved quietly like an old tide returning. When Naomi and I bought this property, he said at last, his voice low and steady, this building was half condemned. No one interrupted him. There were holes in the ceilings, water in the basement, 3 failed investors before us. His eyes drifted briefly toward the portrait. Everyone thought we were crazy. A faint smile touched his mouth for half a second. Truthfully, we probably were. A few guests lowered their eyes. Elijah continued. We didn't have money. We barely had credit. Naomi worked 18-hour days while pregnant because we couldn't afford enough staff. He paused. And before any of this existed, before the awards and magazine covers and investors, my wife cleaned hotel rooms for people who never looked her in the eye. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Daniel stared downward at the marble floor. She used to come home and tell me stories, Elijah said quietly, about guests who snapped their fingers at her instead of speaking, men who handed her trash without acknowledging she was human enough to deserve a hello, women who clutched purses tighter when she stepped onto elevators. The rain outside had softened now into a steady whisper against glass. She told me once that poverty humiliates people long before it hurts them, that eventually some folks stop seeing themselves as human because the world gets so comfortable treating them otherwise. Ava stirred faintly against his shoulder. Elijah kissed the top of her head without breaking eye contact with the room. That's why Naomi built this hotel differently, not to impress rich people, not to create exclusivity. His gaze moved slowly across the lobby. She built it so nobody who walked through those doors would ever feel invisible. The words settled heavily over everyone listening, especially Claire. Tears slid silently down her cheeks now, ruining the careful makeup she had applied before her shift. But she made no move to wipe them away, because for the first time all evening, she understood what she had actually done. Not just refused service, violated something sacred to the people who built this place. Daniel finally found his voice. Mr. Brooks, I truly am sorry. His words sounded strained now, stripped of management polish. I made assumptions I shouldn't have made. Elijah looked at him quietly. Yes, he said. You did. Daniel swallowed hard. I thought I was protecting the hotel. That line lingered in the air longer than Daniel intended it to, because somewhere deep beneath his humiliation, part of him still believed it. Elijah noticed. Of course he noticed. You know what the saddest part is? Elijah asked gently. Daniel looked up. You're not a cruel man. The statement seemed to confuse Daniel more than anger would have. You convinced yourself professionalism meant protecting comfort at the expense of compassion. Elijah's eyes held his steadily. That's how places lose their humanity, not all at once, one rational decision at a time. Near the elevators, Tyler shifted uncomfortably beside Ben. Neither young guard looked capable of meeting Elijah's eyes anymore. Evelyn Grant stepped slightly closer. Mr. Brooks, I'll personally make sure this is handled immediately. Elijah nodded once. Then he turned toward Claire. The young receptionist visibly stiffened. For several seconds, he simply looked at her while she fought unsuccessfully to stop crying. Claire Whitmore had spent years learning how to present certainty, the perfect smile, the perfect posture, the polished confidence luxury hospitality demanded from women standing behind expensive desks. Now, all of it had fallen away. What remained looked startlingly young. "I grew up in Connecticut," she whispered suddenly, before anyone asked her to speak. "My mother cleaned houses." Her voice shook. "People used to look at her the same way I looked at you tonight." The confession surprised even her. Claire stared at the marble counter, as if horrified by the sound of her own honesty. "I told myself I'd never end up being treated like that." Tears slipped faster down her face now, and somewhere along the way, I became the person doing it. Nobody moved. Nobody rushed to comfort her. The moment deserved its full weight. Elijah's expression softened slightly, though sadness remained in it. "When did you stop seeing people?" he asked quietly. Claire broke completely then. Not dramatically, not loudly. Her shoulders simply folded inward as though something inside her had finally collapsed under the pressure of recognition. "I don't know," she whispered. And somehow, that answer hurt more than any excuse could have. Daniel closed his eyes briefly beside her, because the truth was, he knew exactly when it had happened to him. Years ago. Gradually. One compromise at a time, one difficult guest, one complaint from investors, one meeting about image, one reminder that luxury depended on controlling who felt like they belonged, until eventually he stopped questioning the machine and simply became part of it. Ava lifted her head slowly from Elijah's shoulder. She looked at Claire, crying behind the desk for several long seconds. Children recognize pain instinctively. Not context, not power dynamics, just pain. "Daddy," she whispered softly. Elijah looked down immediately. Ava hesitated before speaking again. "I don't want them to hurt anymore." The sentence entered the room like light breaking through dark water. Claire covered her mouth as another sob escaped her. Daniel looked away entirely, and Elijah stopped breathing for just a moment. Because suddenly, standing beneath Naomi's portrait with their daughter in his arms, he heard his wife again so clearly it almost hurt. "Mercy matters most when it's hardest to give." Naomi used to say that, usually after Elijah got angry at someone who deserved it. A tired smile flickered briefly across his face before disappearing again. He crouched slowly so he could look Ava directly in the eyes. "You sure about that, baby?" Ava nodded immediately. They already looked sad. A sound escaped Evelyn Grant then, somewhere between grief and admiration. Elijah remained crouched there for a second longer, studying his daughter's face. Naomi's eyes looked back at him from inside that tiny, exhausted expression. Same softness, same impossible instinct toward kindness. When he finally stood again, the entire lobby waited, not for revenge, for judgment. Elijah looked first toward Evelyn. "Daniel Mercer's employment ends tonight." Daniel flinched as though struck, but he nodded once before Elijah even finished speaking. Not arguing, not defending himself. Maybe because deep down, he already understood. "This hotel doesn't need managers who confuse exclusion with excellence," Elijah continued quietly. Evelyn nodded immediately. "Understood." Daniel removed the name badge clipped to his suit jacket with slow, trembling fingers. For a moment, he stared at it resting in his palm before handing it silently to Evelyn. Nobody watched him with triumph, which somehow made it worse. Then Elijah turned toward Claire. She looked terrified, not just of losing her job, of who she had become. "You won't be fired," Elijah said. Claire blinked in disbelief. "But starting tomorrow, you'll spend 6 months working every department Naomi worked before this hotel existed." His voice remained calm. Housekeeping, laundry, room service, overnight cleaning crews. Claire stared at him silently through tears. You're going to learn the names of every person this building depends on, but rarely notices. You're going to understand what invisible work feels like. Elijah paused. And if, after 6 months, Sarah Collins believes you remember how to see people again, you can reapply for the front desk. Claire began crying harder then, not from relief alone, but from the unbearable realization that she had been offered something she did not deserve. A second chance. And somehow that mercy cut deeper than punishment would have. Thank you, she whispered brokenly. I swear I'll... Don't promise me, Elijah said gently. His eyes drifted down toward Ava. Promise her. Claire followed his gaze toward the little girl in Elijah's arms. The child who had walked into the Monarch Crescent carrying more grace than every adult in the room combined. Ava gave her the smallest uncertain wave. Claire broke into tears all over again. Then Elijah turned finally toward Marcus Reed. The old security guard straightened instinctively. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. Shared history moved silently between them. Years, loss, promises kept. You stayed, Elijah said quietly. Marcus's throat tightened. Yes, sir. Why? Marcus glanced once toward Naomi's portrait. Because she asked me to take care of this place. His voice roughened slightly. And because some promises are too important to outlive. Emotion flashed across Elijah's face before he could hide it. He stepped forward suddenly and embraced the older man tightly. Marcus closed his eyes hard. Several guests looked away at the intimacy of the moment, as though witnessing grief that sacred felt almost intrusive. When Elijah finally stepped back, he rested one hand briefly on Marcus's shoulder. Tomorrow morning, he said softly, you'll report upstairs as the new director of security. Marcus stared at him. Sir, you protected the heart of this place longer than any of us did. Marcus's eyes filled completely then. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. And above them all, illuminated beneath crystal chandeliers and reflected in polished marble, Naomi Brooks continued smiling down at the lobby she once believed could teach people how to see each other properly. The lobby remained silent long after Elijah Brooks finished speaking. Not the awkward silence of strangers waiting for permission to move again. Something quieter, reflective, as though every person standing beneath the chandeliers had suddenly become aware of themselves in ways they had not expected when they walked through the revolving doors that evening. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease. Water still traced silver lines down the tall windows overlooking Lexington Avenue. But the storm itself was moving farther uptown now, carrying the distant growl of thunder away with it. Evelyn Grant stepped carefully toward the reception desk and picked up the wilted bouquet Elijah had set down earlier. For a moment, she looked at the lilies in silence before turning back to him. I had fresh flowers placed in the penthouse suite earlier this evening, she said softly. But I think Naomi would have preferred these. A faint smile touched Elijah's face. She always hated perfect flowers, he said quietly. Said they looked lonely. A few people in the lobby smiled, despite themselves. The tension loosened slightly then, not disappearing, but softening around the edges. Evelyn extended the bouquet back to him with both hands, almost reverently. Elijah accepted it carefully. Then, for the first time since entering the hotel, exhaustion seemed to settle fully into his shoulders. Ava noticed immediately. Daddy, she whispered sleepily, rubbing one eye against his coat. I'm tired. The room softened all over again at the sound of her voice. Elijah brushed his thumb gently across her cheek. I know, baby. Evelyn quickly stepped aside. Your suite is ready whenever you are." Elijah nodded gratefully, but before turning toward the elevators, his eyes drifted once more across the lobby, toward Claire, still standing behind the desk, with swollen eyes, toward Daniel Mercer, quietly gathering the last of his belongings beneath the stunned gaze of employees who only hours earlier had treated him like authority made flesh, toward Marcus Reed, standing straighter than he had in years, toward Sarah Collins. Sarah met Elijah's eyes with tears still shining there. He walked slowly toward her through the center of the lobby, while guests instinctively moved aside to let him pass. When he stopped in front of her, Sarah looked suddenly nervous. "I should have stepped in sooner," she whispered. "I knew something was wrong the moment I saw you." Elijah shook his head gently. "You stepped in when it mattered." Sarah swallowed hard. Naomi used to say this place only worked if people protected each other. At the mention of her name, Elijah's expression softened again. "She was smarter than both of us." Sarah laughed through tears at that, covering her mouth briefly before emotion overtook her all over again. Elijah reached into the pocket of his coat and carefully removed the old photograph of himself and Naomi standing beneath construction scaffolding all those years ago. He looked down at it for a moment before handing it to Sarah. "She always liked you," he said. Sarah stared at the picture as though it was something sacred. "She terrified me," she admitted softly. Elijah smiled faintly. "She terrified everybody." Even Marcus laughed quietly at that. For one brief moment, the lobby no longer felt like the site of a humiliation. It felt almost human again. Then Elijah turned back toward the massive portrait above the fireplace. Naomi's smile watched over the room exactly as it had all evening, unchanged by cruelty, untouched by shame. Elijah crossed the marble floor slowly and rehung the portrait himself. No one spoke while he did it. When he stepped back down from the hearth, Ava lifted her sleepy head again and looked up toward the painting. "Mommy looks happy here," she murmured. Elijah followed her gaze. She was. Ava studied the portrait carefully for another moment. "Do you think she saw everything tonight?" The question hit Elijah harder than any confrontation had. For a second, emotion closed painfully around his throat. He looked down at his daughter, at Naomi's bracelet around her tiny wrist, at the stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest, and suddenly, grief and gratitude tangled together so tightly inside him, he could barely tell them apart anymore. He kissed Ava gently on the forehead. "I think," he whispered, "your mom saw the part that mattered most." "What part?" Elijah looked back once toward Claire. The young receptionist still stood silently behind the desk, eyes red, posture gone soft with humility instead of polish. Then toward Marcus, toward Sarah, toward the guests, quietly reflecting beneath chandelier light. The part where people decided they could still become better. Ava seemed to think about that seriously, despite her exhaustion. Then she nodded once against his shoulder. "Okay." The word was barely audible, but somehow it felt like forgiveness. Evelyn stepped toward the private elevator at the far end of the lobby and pressed the call button. The brass doors opened almost immediately with a soft chime. Before Elijah walked away, Marcus spoke one last time. "Mr. Brooks?" Elijah turned. Marcus hesitated briefly. "She'd be proud of you too, sir." The compliment visibly hurt Elijah more than criticism ever could have, because for years, that had been the one thing he no longer knew how to believe. He lowered his eyes for a moment before answering quietly, "I'm still trying." Marcus nodded with the understanding of a man who had buried people he loved too. Elijah carried Ava toward the elevator then. The wilted lilies resting carefully in one hand, while the other held his daughter securely against his chest. The lobby parted silently around them, not out of fear, out of respect. As the elevator doors began to close, Ava looked back over Elijah's shoulder toward the portrait one final time. "Good night, Mommy," she whispered, and then the doors slid shut. The lobby remained still for several seconds afterward. Eventually, people began moving again, but more slowly than before, as though everyone feared breaking something fragile that had settled over the room. Claire wiped her face quietly behind the desk before turning toward the next arriving guest, an older woman carrying 2 grocery bags and wearing a rain-soaked coat from the storm outside. For the first time that night, Claire stepped out from behind the desk herself. "Let me help you with those," she said softly. The woman blinked in surprise. "Oh, thank you." Claire took the bags carefully, and for once, she looked directly into someone's eyes when she smiled. 1 month later, a grainy cell phone video filmed inside the Monarch Crescent spread across social media faster than anyone inside Brooks Legacy hotels could contain it. The internet gave it a dozen different names before one hashtag finally remained. The Monarch lesson. Millions of people watched the footage of a tired black father standing beneath chandeliers while his little girl asked whether looking poor made someone bad. Millions more watched the moment Marcus Reed bowed his head and welcomed Elijah Brooks home. Commentators argued about race, class, luxury culture, corporate hypocrisy, but the video people replayed most was smaller than all of that. A child saying, "I don't want them to hurt anymore." Within weeks, Brooks Legacy Hotels announced a new company-wide training initiative personally overseen by Elijah Brooks and Evelyn Grant, the Naomi Standard. Every employee, from interns to executives, would now rotate through every operational department before taking permanent positions. Front desk staff cleaned rooms, managers worked overnight maintenance shifts, executives assisted housekeeping teams during peak weekends, not as punishment, as perspective. At the Monarch Crescent, Marcus Reed began his first week as Director of Security in the same Navy uniform he'd worn for 2 decades, though now younger guards straightened instinctively when he entered a room. Sarah Collins took over guest relations officially 3 weeks later, and Claire Whitmore spent her first overnight housekeeping shift kneeling beside a bathtub at 3 in the morning, scrubbing soap stains from marble, while an exhausted single mother sleeping in Suite 814 remained completely unaware of the young woman quietly cleaning around her daughter's stuffed animals with tears slipping silently down her face. Not from humiliation anymore, from understanding. Winter slowly gave way to spring, and one warm April afternoon, Elijah returned once more to the Monarch Crescent with Ava beside him. This time, there were no cameras, no whispers, no confrontation. Just sunlight spilling through the tall lobby windows while guests moved calmly across polished marble beneath the sound of soft piano music. Ava stopped automatically beneath Naomi's portrait. She tilted her face upward, studying her mother's smile with the solemn concentration only children could give to memory. "Daddy?" "Yeah, baby." "Mommy was really beautiful." Elijah looked up at the portrait for a long moment, then down at his daughter. "Yeah," he said softly. "She was." Ava slipped her small hand into his. "What do you think she'd say if she saw the hotel now?" Elijah smiled faintly. "I think she'd say people are still learning." Ava nodded thoughtfully. Then, after a moment, "I think Mommy would want us to help them." Emotion flickered briefly across Elijah's face again. Not sharp this time, gentle, healing. He squeezed her hand lightly as they stood together beneath Naomi's portrait, while afternoon light drifted warmly across the marble floors she once dreamed into existence. And above them, frozen forever in black and white, Naomi Brooks continued smiling down at a world still struggling, still failing, still trying, and still learning, one human being at a time, how to truly see the people standing right in front of them.